evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Joe. He is Nick. And you are listening to a special edition of the Nick and Joe Show on Monday, December the 21st. The year is 2020. For those of you who are listening to us in the future sometime, if we're not here. And I'm in the Think Radio Broadcast Center here in Canada's national capital. And Nick is out on the farm. This is a special show. You could call this the pre-lockdown edition. Because here we are 4 days before Christmas. And the Ford government, the government of Ontario, has decided, come Christmas Eve, it's going to impose a province-wide lockdown in Ontario in reaction to the increased infection rate of COVID-19 in a handful of jurisdictions, principally the Greater Toronto area. While the rest of us in the province are either not experiencing a problem or the rate of infection is under control, we're here in Ottawa. Yes, we have cases, but the number of cases has gone down significantly. It's about a half or thereabouts of what it was a month ago. We've done it all without lockdowns. And now the government has decided, well, I guess Toronto, they're having a problem, so we're going to lock down the whole province. And Nick, about 25% of our listeners are international. And so I think it's helpful for them to understand just how big this province is, because it'll give them some perspective with respect to how big a deal it is that the government would impose a lockdown across the entire province just because one region, one city is experiencing this problem with a high infection rate for COVID-19.
I don't think people really do understand. It takes 24 hours to drive across this province. When you're under it in Quebec and you leave it at Manitoba, that's 24 hours behind the wheel. This is a massive province. This would be probably half a dozen European countries in size. I've spent a lot of time in the North Bay area in the last month or so, and that is completely different than it is in the Ottawa Valley, which is completely different than Sudbury, which is completely different than downtown Toronto.
That's still clustered sort of in the eastern, southern regions.
We haven't talked about Kenora, and we haven't talked about Timmins or Temiskaming or any of these far-reaching northern places. We haven't mentioned Windsor. We haven't mentioned Cornwall or James Bay. If you look at the island, the continent of Australia, imagine a 30% increase in its land mass, and now you have the size of Ontario. So because there's so many differences in Ontario, so many different, even if looking at it from the virus point of view, you have different infection rates, you have different, like here in Renfrew County, we have it virtually none. I don't know what the numbers are. I know it's not none, but it's very, very low. You've got, up in Sudbury and these different corners of the province, there just isn't any. There just isn't. And it's only when you get down into the major centers around the Golden Horseshoe, that's when you run into it. I think the reason why they're locking down the whole province is because they're afraid of region hopping. Like if you lock down the Golden Horseshoe, the people who don't want to be locked down will move to the periphery areas that aren't locked down or don't have as severe restrictions. And they're saying that is the case right now. I don't know if it is or not, but from that perspective, if you want to stop people from, say, going from Toronto to Muskoka or from Toronto to North Bay or Timmins, lock down the whole province and they can't go.
The first thing, let's be clear, the lockdowns have failed to produce the desired effects in the jurisdictions where they're currently in force. I think that's really important to state unequivocally. That's where, it's to the degree that there's some panic in this latest order, that's where it originates from. And particularly in the jurisdiction we're talking about, Toronto, Peel region, which is adjacent to Toronto, Vaughan region, which is adjacent to Toronto. So in that area, and then, beyond a little bit, as you say, the Golden Horseshoe. So, Hamilton and some of the smaller cities and towns in that region. There's a whole cluster of, that's where the bulk of Ontario's population is. Now, how extending lockdowns to jurisdictions where the infection rate is actually under control, like Ottawa and the Eastern Ontario, how that'll help in Toronto is simply beyond my understanding. And when asked this, apparently the Premier suggested, as you say, Nick, that the goal was to prevent region hopping. And I'm thinking, region hopping? If region hopping, the idea that we're going to go from one region to the next because we want to go shopping, if it was a legitimate problem, then the problem would already be evident in higher infection rates in the other adjacent regions. And that's just not the case, which is exactly why the question was raised in the first place in the press conference.
First of all, I don't believe the polls, where over 70% of people want lockdowns. I just don't believe it. Not after coming through this last summer with the kind of chaos that caused and the problems that caused. And not just COVID-related problems. Well, they're all COVID-related problems, but not from the virus itself, but from people who are suffering mental stress and illness because they can't get out. You have other medical procedures that can't be done because we don't have the capacity in our hospitals to deal with that and COVID. So there's a lot of frustration out there, and I'm not the only one that feels it. I doubt that really. I'm ready to tell the government just to go stick it where the sun don't shine. I guess what it boils down to is I don't trust the government to tell me the truth.
I don't know what the point of polling is on this. It's either the right policy or it's the wrong policy. I agree with you, Nick. I'm not familiar with the polls that are being cited here. When I hear that 70% of people want lockdowns, I don't believe that either. Numbers like that, 70% is a pretty high rating, and you would think that if 70% of the population wants a lockdown, I'd kind of already be hearing that in the conversations that I have with people, and I'm not hearing it.
So the poll is skewed from the beginning.
Probably.
Here's just a quick paragraph, and this is from the CBC, who are generally speaking center-left at best. But let me just share with people this little section of the news story coming to us from CBC. The lockdown also means Ontarians are advised to stay home to the fullest extent possible. Now, pay attention to this next sentence. Ford said people should only leave home for essential trips such as work or groceries. If he locks the province down like this, there won't be any work to go to. Why aren't you using armories to set up short-term ICUs near hospitals so we can get the COVID patients out of the hospitals and make room for the other serious medical situations?
Well,
why aren't we doing that? If we are, how come we're not doing more of it?
Just on that topic, Nick, let me point out that the hospitals are not being overrun by COVID patients to the point where there is no room left in them for other procedures. The practice is to restrict other procedures for fear that you're going to infect other people. If the rate of infections continue to increase the way they're going, then in these jurisdictions, the hospitals will be overwhelmed by COVID patients. And the answer the government has come up with to respond to the overtaxing of the healthcare system is to say, well, we're prepared to shut down the economy to save the healthcare system the way it is, rather than finding creative ways to expand healthcare in order to deal with the increased demand on it because of the sickness. And like you said armories, but it could be anywhere. Why not set up temporary ICUs? I'm not underrating the complexity and the logistics involved in that and the costs involved, but surely to goodness, all of those things put together, logistics, costs, and all of that is still less expensive and still less intrusive than shutting the entire economy in the province down. So I say, why not let the economy continue to flourish? And for those people who are ill and require hospitalization. If the hospital is not able to handle the demand, find a way on a temporary basis to expand the availability of hospital facilities.
I think, Joseph, that there's more disinformation after today's press conference than information. And we cannot continue this. At some point, people have to tell the government in no uncertain terms, enough. I am tired of living in a terrified society. I am tired of people being so afraid that they are scared of their own shadow. And that I don't want to live that way.
You know, another important problem with this is that the order actually comes into effect several days from now, Christmas Eve, to be exact. And this raises the question, if the situation is so dire that it requires the entire province to be locked down, then what possible justification could there be for waiting several days? Why not do it now? And the answer, it seems, is that by delaying its coming into force, the government is giving people a chance to do whatever shopping and other activities that they have to do in preparation for the lockdown before it goes into effect. But that just begs the question, Nick, if the reason that we're ordering a shutdown is to prevent people from gathering in large concentrations, what sense is there in creating the very conditions where the public is going to be encouraged to gather in large numbers and concentrations than they normally would, especially given the fact that we're in the pre-Christmas shopping season? So Boxing Day, instead of a store holding its Boxing Day sale on the 27th when they won't be able to open, so I'll just have my Boxing Day sale on the 23rd. Here's the other thing, okay, and you touched on this, Nick. These actions are actually, in my mind, there's an element of danger to them. And you touched on this before when you were talking about lawful authority. And I, too, I believe that in a free society, people have an obligation to obey lawful authority. But that only works if people respect that lawful authority and they have faith in the democratic safeguards that exist. And when respect for people exercising lawful authority and when trust in democratic safeguards and institutions disappears, then the will of the people to freely submit themselves to that authority also disappears. And that's a very dangerous situation, because if we as a free people are not willing to freely subordinate ourselves to the law, the only arrow that's left in the government's quiver is coercion. And once the government gets into coercing people to follow the law as a general rule, because there are always going to be people that you have to coerce in any society, but once that becomes the main tool available to the government, because people no longer trust government and they no longer trust lawful authority, then we no longer live in a free society, even if the law that the government is trying to enforce is a sensible, reasonable, logical law. And I don't think that there are a lot of people in government that are actually hitting the pause button and saying, okay, guys, we really need to think this through. When I look at this and I look at some of the other things that are out there and things that are coming down the pipe with all of the regulations and all of the talk now again about climate change being an existential threat and we have to have policies to stop the climate from changing. And then the financial problems that we're going to have to deal with as a consequence of the way we responded to this whole pandemic. I look at the next 12 to 24 months with a certain amount of trepidation, Nick, and I hesitate to say that we in this part of the world are at the tipping point, but